welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 46, The Sons of Monomakh, Part 1. Before we start, thank you to New Boyar Jerome and to Tsar Mohaned for his outstanding continuing support. We left off last episode with Vladimir Monomakh dying and leaving behind a succession plan in which his son Mstislav would take over. Once again, a deviation from the lateral succession system. Surprisingly, given that he is called the Great, the chroniclers have left us rather sparse information about Mstislav, including what he did to tip him over from being merely a successful and well-regarded ruler and military commander like his father into someone worthy of special acclaim. So let's start with the known knowns. On the death of his father, Mstislav, known to Norse sagas and his mum, Guta, daughter of Harold Godwinson of England, as Harold, and baptized as Fyodor, ascended the throne in Kyiv the very next day, 20th of May, 1125. He was the first son to succeed directly since Yaroslav, and he would rule for only 7 years. Last episode, we looked at the instruction of Vladimir Monomakh, the document he left to guide his sons and determine the succession. There had not previously been any document like this in Rus, and some historians suggest that it was written at the behest of Guta, inspired by an Anglo-Saxon tradition. Others link it to the Mirrors for Princes tradition in the Middle Ages, where a guide to leadership would be written for new rulers, often focusing on how they should embody the Christian ideals. Either explanation is interesting as another example of Rus' often overlooked connections to Western European culture. Judging by the chronicles, there was no opposition to Mstislav taking the throne, suggesting once again that Oleg had indeed renounced his claim. So Oleg's younger brother, Yaroslav, who had genealogical seniority, was passed over. Once again, the chronicler also states that Mstislav was popularly acclaimed and that the townspeople of Kyiv had summoned him to rule. Despite not matching the genealogical seniority rules, he was a strong candidate. He was the head of the Monomakhichi, the sons of Monomakh, who now controlled most of Rus. While he sat in Kyiv, his brothers controlled Pereyaslavl, Rostov-Suzdal, Vladimir in Volhynia, and Turov. Mstislav's own sons ruled in Novgorod, Smolensk, and Kursk. The rival clan of the Sviatoslavichi controlled only Chernihiv and Murom, and were therefore militarily far weaker. The Izyaslavichi had been almost removed from power entirely. Vladimir Monomakh had given their capital Turov to his son Vyacheslav. Svyatopolk's sons had been sent to minor towns in the hinterland. The accession of Mstislav was therefore the final blow to their hopes of power. The Izyaslavichi family had lost their political weight and would never rule in Kyiv again. Our trio of rival families has now been reduced to a duo. The Svyavolodovichi of Pereyaslavl and the Sviatoslavichi of Chernihiv. Mstislav's appeal to the people of Kyiv is not too hard to understand. As we heard in the last episode, he had already proved himself a capable ruler over 20 years in charge of Novgorod, and he was a renowned commander whose defeat of Oleg was regarded by his contemporaries as one of the great victories in Rus military history. Yaroslav Sviatoslavich had no comparable accomplishments. As you will recall from last time, Vladimir Monomakh had moved Mstislav to Bilhorod-Kievsky, nothing more than a fortress near Kyiv and certainly not a city, in order for him to secure the succession. This meant that when he took over, it did not trigger the usual reshuffle, and his brothers and sons remained in the cities that they had already been given. Yaropolk, their next brother, was in Pereyaslav, Vyacheslav in Turov, Yuri in Rostov and Suzdal, and Andrei in Vladimir in Volhynia. Mstislav's son Vsevolod was in Novgorod, Izyaslav in Kursk, and Rostislav in Smolensk. His youngest sons, Svyatopolk and Vladimir, did not yet have their own domains. However, spoiler alert, if you've been finding it hard to keep track of who's who and who is being moved where over the last couple of episodes, it's going to get worse, much worse, when Mstislav dies, and it will take decades to return to stability. The chronicler calls him Mstislav the Great, which might make you think that he did something extraordinary, defeat some great rival, issue some law that changed Rus forever, or something else of significance. Unfortunately, they did not tell us what it was. The Chronicle is very impressed with him defeating Oleg Sviatoslavich, but it seems like that could hardly have been enough on its own. In fact, we have very little information about the 7 years of his reign at all. He had the usual problems, forcing the other kings and princes to acknowledge his supremacy. In Galicia, Volodar and Vasilko Rostislavich had died, and their sons fell out over their inheritances. It got as far as war and flights into exile, but Mstislav intervened. The brothers accepted his authority, and peace was restored. Mstislav married his daughter to Vsevolod Olgovich, son of Oleg Sviatoslavich, who managed to push his uncle out of Chernihiv and take over. Yaroslav Sviatoslavich appealed to Mstislav, reminding him that he had sworn to assist him. Vsevolod was not to be persuaded to give up his city, so Mstislav prepared to attack with his brother Yaropolk. Meanwhile, Vsevolod summoned the Polovtsi to assist him. Messengers from the nomads to Vsevolod were captured by Yaropolk, and unable to make contact with Vsevolod, they left. That was not the end of the drama. Vsevolod realized that he was not strong enough to stand alone, so he bribed Mstislav's advisor to talk him out of attacking Chernihiv. By this time, Mstislav was feeling trapped by his oath, so he asked Igumen Andrei of the monastery of St. Andrew to release him. The monk did not have much difficulty finding an excuse. He declared that attacking Chernihiv would mean killing Christians, and would therefore be a much worse sin than breaking his oath to Yaroslav. Mstislav called off the campaign, and Vsevolod acknowledged that he was in his debt. The next challenge came from Polotsk, which was once again trying to go its own way. Mstislav displayed his authority here by directing the campaign without personally marching out. He sent his brothers, Vyacheslav and Andrei, together with a couple of minor princes, to attack Izyaslavo to the northwest of Minsk. Vsevolod Olgovich and his brothers were sent to attack Borisov northeast of Minsk. His son Izyaslav was sent from Kursk to attack Logozhsk, north of Minsk, and another son, Rostislav, from Smolensk, to attack Drutsk. A force of Turks were also sent with one of his men. The people of the various towns of Polotsk surrendered or were defeated by these forces, and then Vsevolod joined the campaign with the army of Novgorod. That was enough for the people of Polotsk itself. They threw out David Mstislav and asked Mstislav to install the loyal Rogvolod Mstislav to replace him, which Mstislav did. Following this, Mstislav's attention turned to the Polotsk, who were once again raiding Rus. Despite the defeats that they had suffered, the princes of Polotsk continued to cause trouble, forcing his attempts to gather forces against the steppe. So in 1129 he went to war alone. Details are scant in the chronicles. We're told that while Vladimir Monomakh had driven the Polotsk beyond the Don, Mstislav drove them all the way to the Volga and saved Rus from the pagans. When he returned victorious, it was time to deal with Polotsk. He summoned the insubordinate princes, David, Rostislav, and Sviatoslav, as well as Vasily and Ivan, the sons of Rogvolod, to appear before him in Kyiv. He told them that they had violated their oath of allegiance, oaths they had sealed by kissing the cross. Therefore, as punishment, they were exiled to Byzantium. Naturally, this also meant that Mstislav took their lands for himself. He gave Polotsk to his son Izyaslav, moving him from Kursk, and installed his posadniki in the other towns. The whole of Polotsk was now Monomakhichi territory. Mstislav's next move was something we haven't seen yet in our narrative. Remember the Chud, one of the peoples around right back at the very beginning of Rus and the arrival of Rurik. The Chud, ancestors of modern Estonians, were living west of Novgorod on the shores of the Baltic Sea. Mstislav sent Vsevolod, Izyaslav, and Rostislav with the armies of Novgorod, Polotsk, and Smolensk to attack the Chud, presumably with the intention of expanding the territory under Vsevolod's control, giving him a chance to increase his reputation and standing. The Chud were subjugated and forced to pay tribute. While they may not have been the most imposing opponent, the Rus projecting force over this distance, it's almost twice as far from Kyiv to the Baltic coast as it is from Kyiv to Crimea, was a new level of achievement. It was also unusual for Kyiv to be assisting Novgorod in its expansionary aims, which had already seen it establishing control over Finno-Ugrian territory to the north and northeast. Perhaps Mstislav wished to demonstrate the benefits to Novgorod of remaining in close alliance with the capital. The following year, Mstislav undertook a punitive campaign against the Lithuanians, burning their homes and returning with much loot. The chronicle does not tell us what triggered this. The most likely theory is that in taking over the Polotsk lands, which adjoined Lithuanian territory, he now had new defensive obligations. Mstislav's action, which did not attempt to conquer the Lithuanians, would therefore have been in response to raiding. This was the first Rus campaign against the Lithuanians, and it will not be the last. Mstislav died on 15th of April 1132, aged just 56. He had nominated Yaropolk, the next eldest surviving son of Vladimir Monomakh, as his successor, and charged him with taking care of his children. He was buried in a new church that he had built in Kyiv, the Church of St. Theodore, which would become the family mausoleum for his descendants until the end of the 12th century. Mstislav had been married to Kristin, the daughter of King Inge Steinkason of Sweden. Rus ties to Scandinavia have been drifting out of the focus of our story, but this is evidence that they still had some significance. Inge had been driven into exile earlier in his life, and like other exiled Scandinavian rulers, he had ended up in Kyiv. Sometime around 1080, he was summoned home and claimed his throne, and then in 1095, when Mstislav took over in Novgorod, he married Inge's daughter. Due to the scarcity of surviving records, we do not know any more than that. We do not know whether Inge was looking for Rus support in securing his throne, or whether it was just the result of friendship between the families. Kristin lived in Rus for almost 30 years, and once again the chroniclers see no reason to mention a woman. Mstislav remarried after her death, more unusually this time. His second wife was the daughter of a former posadnik of Novgorod, named Dmitry Zavidich. That is, someone who was not royal, a very rare case in the ruling families of Rus. It appears that Dmitry, like Mstislav, was chosen by the people of Novgorod, in this case to be their posadnik, and therefore was a man of influence and authority in the city. His son would also become posadnik. We can therefore see this as a marriage that reinforced Mstislav's position in Novgorod. While it might not be quite clear how Mstislav earned the title of Great, we can acknowledge that he appears to have been a successful ruler. He ruled Novgorod for 20 years and enjoyed popular support. As ruler of Kyiv, he retained his family's loyalty, subjugated insubordinate princes, secured the borders against the Polovtsi, imposed tribute on the Chud, and punished the Lithuanians for their incursions. There's only one crack in this picture. We've seen that the brothers and sons of Mstislav carried out his orders in various campaigns, and there's no hint that any of them ever went against him. But one name is missing: Yuri, the younger brother in Susdalia. The explanation may be perfectly innocent. It could simply be a question of distance from the core Ruslands. The chronicle does not tell us that there was any discord between the brothers. But retrospectively, as we see what's about to follow, we might have some reason to wonder. The people of Kiev followed Mstislav's wishes and invited Yaropolk to take the throne. He arrived in Kiev 2 days later. Once again, we see the chronicler presenting the decision of the townspeople as critical, even if the succession was following the path designated by the previous ruler. Throne secured, the next task was to appoint his own successor in Pereyaslavl. The normal succession would have been the next eldest brother, in this case Vyacheslav of Turov. But instead he summoned Mstislav's son, Vsevolod, from Novgorod. The chronicle tells us that he did this according to the agreement the brothers had made with their father, Vladimir Monomakh, who had given Pereyaslavl to Mstislav and Yaropolk jointly. This agreement is not part of the instruction, and is not provided elsewhere in the chronicle. The meaning is rather unclear. As you know, Mstislav had been placed in Bilgorod by his father, not Pereyaslavl, so we don't know what is meant by them supposedly being co-rulers in Pereyaslavl. Yaropolk moving Vsevolod there implies that Pereyaslavl was supposed to become the patrimony of the Mstislavichi. Some scholars have suggested that there was a lost testament of Monomach, similar to Yaroslav's, in which he instructed that the line of succession was to be Mstislav Yaropolk Vsevolod. According to this interpretation, Mstislav was indeed given Pereyaslavl, because after he moved from Novgorod, he would have been the only one of the sons without a domain. Yaropolk also had no domain, but also no sons. Therefore, he was placed in Pereyaslavl, while Mstislav was busy elsewhere, but the succession was to follow Mstislav's sons. Consequently, the younger sons of Monomach would be barred from inheriting Pereyaslavl. However, in contrast to Yaropolk's smooth accession in Kyiv, there was no welcome carpet rolled out for Vsevolod in Pereyaslavl. The same day he reached the city, his uncles, Yuri of Suzdalya and Andrei of Vladimir in Volhynia, arrived in force and drove him out. They claimed that Yaropolk had given him the city to position him as the heir to Kyiv, and they were not going to accept that. Notably, the chronicle's discussion of the allocation of Pereyaslavl to Mstislav and Yaropolk and to the sons of Mstislav makes no mention of Kyiv. And, spoiler alert, when Vsevolod Olgovich occupies Kyiv and takes the throne himself, he will assert that he was designated by Monomakh and Oleg to succeed Yaropolk as part of the agreement that led to Monomakh ruling. There is no mention anywhere in the chronicle that Vsevolod was supposed to be Yaropolk's successor. Therefore, the plan that Yuri and Andrei are moving to thwart may not even have existed. Yuri held Pereyaslavl for just a week before Yaropolk drove him out. This time, he summoned Vsevolod's younger brother, Izyaslav, to come from Polotsk. But Yuri and Andrei continued to object to any Mstislavichi occupying Pereyaslavl, and Yaropolk was forced to concede for the sake of peace and ask another brother, Vyacheslav of Turov, to take over the city. As the next eldest of the Monomashichi, Vyacheslav had a clear claim to succeed Yaropolk in Kyiv. So if the objection was that Pereyaslavl was a stepping stone to Kyiv, the younger brothers no longer had any basis for resisting. Izyaslav was given the newly vacated Turov. Vsevolod tried to return to Novgorod. But once again, the people had no forgiveness for a ruler who had given them up for another city, and they refused to accept him. By attempting to give Vsevolod Pereyaslavl, as far as we can tell, solely for the purpose of ensuring that Pereyaslavl became the patrimony of the Mstislavichi, and not with any ulterior objectives in Kyiv, Yaropolk had managed to kick off a rivalry that would last for decades. This time, violating the traditions of lateral succession would not work out. Yaropolk himself was secure. As the eldest surviving son of Monomach, no one disputed his claim. The disputes would all revolve around who had the right to rule elsewhere. Yuri and Andrei seem to have decided that as it had been the city of Vladimir Monomakh, Pereyaslavl should go to the next in line to Kyiv. Any other candidate was a potential usurper of their birthright. Vladimir Monomakh's authority and Mstislav's personal reputation had been enough to support Mstislav ruling out of line, but now things were back to normal, and that meant Yaropolk, followed by Vyacheslav, followed by Yuri, followed by Andrei. The initial conflict was a disaster for the sons of Mstislav. Vsevolod lost Novgorod and was left with nothing for the meantime. Izyaslav lost Polotsk but received Turov. Yaropolk had failed to fulfill his promise to take care of them. Vyacheslav made the problem worse. He lacked the political ambitions of his brothers and appears to have been deeply attached to Turov. He did not want to be in Pereyaslavl and even tried to just walk out and go home. He got as far as Gorodets Ostersky, modern Oster in Ukraine, a town belonging to Yuri, where Yaropolk caught him and sent him back to Pereyaslavl. Instead, he surprised everyone by riding east and seizing Ryazan as a bargaining chip. No agreement was reached, and he was forced to go back to Pereyaslavl. Yaropolk derided him as being as bad as a Polovtsian and ordered him to keep his peace. Vyacheslav, who obviously really liked Turov, responded by driving out Izyaslav and returning to his city. Yaropolk was stuck. Now Izyaslav was also left without a domain, and he lacked a candidate to install in Pereyaslavl that would not provoke Yuri and Andrei. On the other hand, the people of Novgorod had relented and agreed to accept Vsevolod back. After several months, Yuri persuaded Yaropolk to give him Pereyaslavl. The chronicler says this was in exchange for some, but not all, of his Rostov and Suzdal lands. But it's more likely that this was actually in exchange only for the tribute from these lands, while they remained Yuri's domain. This time it was Izyaslav's turn to be enraged. He stood firm that Pereyaslavl belonged to the Mstislavichi and not to any son of Monomakh. He travelled to Novgorod to meet with Vsevolod and another brother, Svyatopolk, and they decided that they should ask for help from their brother-in-law, Vsevolod Olgovich, who had married their sister Maria, most likely as part of the agreements between Monomakh Mstislav and Oleg Svyatoslavich. It turned out that Vsevolod Olgovich was very open to a bit of violent competition among the ruling families, and they decided that their first move should be a new domain for Izyaslav, say by taking some of Suzdalia from Yuri. Unfortunately, the townspeople of Novgorod declined to join that fight, so Izyaslav was left sitting in a little town called Voloklamsky. There's going to be quite a lot of this maneuvering without much to show for it. In the autumn of 1134, Yaropolk, Yuri, and Andrei decided to go on the offensive and attack Chernihiv. Vsevolod Olgovich, who had sent word to his Polovtsian allies, sat inside the city walls and declined to fight. Rus siege warfare was still poorly developed, so the Monomashishi were unable to achieve anything and had to go home. When the Polovtsi finally arrived, Vsevolod joined up with the other Olgovichi and Izyaslav and Svyatopolk Mstislavich to raid Yuri's land around Pereyaslavl. Both sides lacked the resources to move their armies across the Dnieper, so they withdrew and concluded a peace agreement, during which Vsevolod reiterated his demand that Yaropolk return all the lands of his father Oleg Svyatoslavich to him, and threatened to continue the war if he did not. Instead, Yaropolk and Yuri returned their armies to Chernihiv and threatened Vsevolod. Once again, peace talks were opened. Why all this toing and froing without either open warfare or real peace agreements? Well, neither Yaropolk nor Vsevolod Olgovich was actually interested in war. They were both just maneuvering to try and support their allies' claims. Yaropolk for his brothers, Vsevolod for his brothers-in-law. Now they reached an agreement. Yaropolk moved his younger brother, Andrei, to Pereyaslavl and gave the newly vacant Vladimir in Volhynia to Izyaslav. Yuri withdrew to Susdalia. It seems likely that Yuri agreed to hand Pereyaslavl to his brother because Vsevolod Mstislavich had managed to persuade the people of Novgorod to join the campaign against Susdalia. Although Yuri's son Rostislav managed to win a battle against them on 26 January 1135, it was clear that the threat from Novgorod was real and would need to be defended. This compromise agreement was on fairly shaky ground. The Monomashichi had a claim to rule in Pereyaslavl by order of seniority based on the traditional ladder of inheritance. The Mstislavichi had an equally legitimate claim based on the decision of the ruler of Kyiv, in this case both their grandfather Vladimir Monomakh and their father Mstislav, to assign the city to them, just as Yaroslav had decided his successors. Andrei, on the other hand, as the youngest Monomashichi, did not have a direct claim to Pereyaslavl until his brothers were dead. A successful settlement would depend on Izyaslav making Vladimir in Volhynia into his own patrimony. But although Yaropolk had managed for the time being to pacify Izyaslav, Vsevolod Olgovich was still demanding the returns of the Olgovich lands the Monomashichi had taken. And in case you think I'm hiding what these lands are, no, the chronicle does not tell us. In the late summer of 1135, he escalated the conflict with a sudden attack on the Monomashichi, this time by just the Olgovichi without their Mstislavichi allies. On 29th December, he defeated the combined forces of all four of the brothers and moved to place Vyshgorod, a fortified town outside Kyiv, under siege. With the war going against them, the Metropolitan begged Yaropolk to agree a peace that would spare Christian lives. So on 12th January 1136, a settlement was reached and the disputed domain was returned. We are still not told where it was, but some historians believe it was Kursk, which had changed hands several times and which the Monomashichi had annexed to Pereyaslavl. So, 3 years of conflict appear to have ended in peace. But Yaropolk has broken his oath to Mstislav to care for his sons, and Chernihiv has returned to being military power capable of challenging Kyiv. The Monomashichi can no longer claim to be the unchallenged dominant force in Rus. In late spring 1136, Novgorod kicked off once again. This time, the trigger was the failed campaign into Susdalia, where Vsevolod was accused of being the first to flee the battle. His previous offence in abandoning Novgorod for Pereyaslavl still rankled, and now he was also accused of neglecting peasant welfare and dragging the city into the political maneuvers between Kyiv and Chernihiv. The people of Novgorod, Pskov, and Ladoga therefore seized and imprisoned Vsevolod and his boyars. They released him a couple of months later, in mid-July, and he fled to Yaropolk in Kyiv. Meanwhile, the Novgorodians invited Sviatoslav Olgovich to take over. He arrived and tried to cement his position by marrying into a Novgorod boyar family, but the Archbishop of Novgorod banned the priests of Novgorod from performing or attending the wedding, Sviatoslav had to bring in his own priest. This episode shows us that the situation in Novgorod was not straightforward. Clearly, there were factions. Some were supporting the Mstislavici, some the Olgovici. The fact that Vsevolod fled to Yaropolk shows that he had changed sides to join the Monomashichi against the Olgovici, and the city was likely divided over this. The Monomashichi had controlled Novgorod for more than 40 years, and we've seen Novgorod's long-standing connection with Kyiv. The invitation to an Olgovich of the Chernihiv family was a significant break with tradition. It indicates the shift in power was serious, and the people of Novgorod now saw the Olgovichi as the most powerful branch of the ruling clan. The loss of Novgorod was another serious blow for Monomashichi prestige. After military defeat by the Olgovichi and the loss of Kursk, or whichever domain it was that they had surrendered, it also left Yaropolk once again with the problem of providing Vsevolod with a worthy domain, even though all the Monomashichi cities were occupied. Novgorod remained in a high state of tension. In early 1137, Vsevolod's supporters attempted to rebel against Sviatoslav. They lost, and in March the conspirators fled to join Vsevolod in Vyshgorod. Despite their failure, they somehow convinced Vsevolod that the people of Novgorod were waiting for his return, so he travelled to Pskov to join his brother Sviatopolk. When the news reached Novgorod, it turned out that the majority was, in fact, opposed to his return, and instead his supporters were forced to flee to join him in Pskov. Sviatoslav, with the support of his brother Gleb of Kursk and the Polovtsi, marched on Pskov. The city stood firm with the Mstislavici, and the Olgovici decided once again that they should not shed Christian blood, and returned home. Soon after, the situation resolved itself. Vsevolod died in February 1138. The people of Pskov confirmed Sviatopolk Mstislavich as their prince. Yaropolk no longer needed to find another domain, and Sviatoslav had no immediate rival for Novgorod. Izyaslav became the head of the Mstislavici. But the Monomashichi were still not prepared to accept the loss of Novgorod. The Rus domains controlled by Monomashichi or Mstislavici began a boycott of the city. The exclusion of the city, dependent as always on trade, undermined Sviatoslav, and in April 1138 he was deposed. Although the people of Novgorod were ready to return to the Monomashichi, they did not want a Mstislavich or a representative of Kyiv. Instead, they sent an emissary to Yuri of Susdalia, and on 10th of May, his son Rostislav arrived in the city. According to the chronicle, this ended the dispute in the city. The disputes elsewhere still continued. Vsevolod Olgovich had attacked Pereyaslavo once again. The chronicle does not tell us why, but most likely this was an attempt to force the lifting of the boycott of Novgorod. Then came the news that Rostislav Mstislavich had captured Sviatoslav Olgovich when he was passing by Smolensk on his way to get away from Novgorod. Vsevolod's response was to declare war on Yaropolk and march on Kyiv, before turning around and retreating to Chernihiv when he heard how big Yaropolk's army was. This time, Yaropolk had called in all his allies, with contingents from Rostov, Smolensk, Pereyaslav, Turov, Vladimir in Volhynia, Polotsk, Galicia, Hungary, and 30,000 Berendei Turkic warriors from the Ros River. Vsevolod immediately agreed to peace talks, as part of which his brother was released to him. This episode shows the Mstislavichi aligned with Yaropolk, but we should be cautious about thinking that their previous alliance with Vsevolod Olgovich had been directed against Yaropolk. Although Yaropolk had broken his oath regarding them, it had not been for want of trying, and looking at the overall situation, we can see that their disputes were with Yuri and Andrei, not with Kyiv. Therefore, with the death of Vsevolod, Mstislav settled in Vladimir in Volhynia, and the compromise candidate Andrei in Pereyaslavl, it appears that Yaropolk has succeeded in reuniting the Monomashichi and the Mstislavichi, and making himself the head of the most powerful faction in Rus once again. But were they really reunited? The people of Novgorod had spurned both the Mstislavichi and Kyiv and turned to Yuri of Susdalia. Yuri controlled the Volga trade direction, and therefore his boycott would have had a significant impact on Novgorod. There were solid reasons to get into his good books. Yuri had a link to Novgorod because his elder brother Mstislav had ruled there for 20 years, after moving there from Rostov himself. Like the earlier generation of Izyaslav, Sviatoslav, and Vsevolod, Yuri chose to send his son to rule in Novgorod. Was this an assertion of independence, a claim to seniority among the Monomashichi? Was he declaring that he was the equal of the kings of Kyiv, who had previously given their sons to rule in Novgorod? More importantly, did the ruler of Rostov and Suzdal have his own interests which diverged from those of Kyiv? The chroniclers do not record any objection from Yaropolk to Yuri placing his son in Novgorod, but this was another turning point. The Novgorodians had chosen a new ruling family from among the Monomashichi and were moving towards independence from Kyiv. Yaropolk died in Kyiv on 18th of February 1139. His funeral was rather strange. For some reason he was buried at St. Andrew's Convent. Rather than a kingly tomb within the church, he was buried in the graveyard along with the nuns. Not the most prestigious interment. 6 years later, his widow had him moved into the church. Yaropolk's reign was mostly taken up with internal strife, but he did manage to score some successes. His own rule in Kyiv was not challenged. The appointment of Izyaslav Mstislavich to Vladimir in Volhynia resolved his claim to Pereyaslavl, and it became his family patrimony. The boycott of Novgorod was most likely his idea and achieved its purpose, and he did manage to reassert his authority over Vsevolod Olgovich in the end. On the flip side, his failure to fulfill his promise to Mstislav concerning his sons has seen him called indecisive and prone to unsatisfactory compromises, and he lost Kyiv's control over Novgorod. The problems he faced were the same ones we have already seen causing trouble in Rus. The system of lateral succession works when fewer people survive to exercise their claims, fewer brothers and fewer sons of brothers. Expanding families bring expanding problems. Leaders like Vladimir Monomakh and Mstislav could bring order through their extraordinary personal authority that kept the families of the ruling clan in line. Lesser men, even if generally competent, could not. Yaropolk could not make his brothers accept his disposition of Pereyaslavl, and he could not make Vyacheslav live there. He could not assert the supremacy of Kyiv when Yuri decided to act independently in Novgorod. Family rivalries are becoming political rivalries. The cracks in Rus are starting to appear. Join me next episode to find out who will take the throne in Kyiv next. Don't forget to keep sending your questions for the episode 50 Q&A through the Spotify app, Twitter, Facebook, or email to hello@therussianempirehistorypodcast.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.